The courtroom was packed that day in Midview, California. The air hung heavy not just with the summer heat, but with the palpable tension of a life-altering decision about to be delivered. All eyes were fixed on Judge Elias Thorne, a man whose reputation was as unyielding as his gaze. He wasn't known for leniency. His judgments were swift, firm, and by all accounts, unshakable. At 62, with 35 years on the bench, his face was etched with the weight of countless lives he had altered with the swing of his gavel. The defendant, 24-year-old Alex Vance, stood at the defense table, his hands trembling slightly but his gaze steady. He wore the kind of expression that comes from a lifetime of trying to prove yourself. Alex had always maintained his innocence, even during his arrest for the armed robbery of a jewelry store that left one man critically injured. But today his voice wouldn't matter. "Mr. Vance," Judge Thorne began, his deep baritone filling the room, "you stand convicted by a jury of your peers for crimes that have caused irreparable harm to this community. Your actions were not only reckless but calculated, and you have shown no remorse." Alex's mother, seated in the back row, stifled a sob. She had begged the court to see him as more than a case number, to consider the boy she had raised, the boy who once dreamed of becoming a pilot. But the evidence had spoken louder. Eyewitness accounts, surveillance footage, and an anonymous tip that had sealed his fate. "I hereby sentence you to 60 years in state prison," Judge Thorne declared, his gavel striking the oak block. The sound echoed, final and absolute. Alex stood motionless, his lips pressed into a thin line, as if holding back words he knew would never change anything. The room erupted, gasps, whispers, and the shuffle of reporters jotting notes. But for Alex, the world had gone silent. He turned to look at his mother one last time before being led away, his shackled footsteps fading down the hall. Judge Thorne returned to his chambers, shutting the door against the noise. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, staring into the swirling liquid as if it held some answer. Justice as he saw it had been served. Or so he thought. Little did he know, the truth he had just buried would soon come clawing its way to the surface, refusing to stay hidden. The trial had been one for the books, dubbed the Vance robbery case by local news outlets, dominating headlines for weeks. The crime itself was a spectacle. A masked gunman storming into Sterling Jewels in downtown Midview on a busy Thursday afternoon, brandishing a weapon and making off with over $150,000 in stolen goods. The chaos left one store clerk, Samuel Grant, fighting for his life after being struck in the crossfire. Alex Vance, a part-time delivery driver with no prior criminal record, had been arrested 2 weeks after the robbery. An anonymous caller tipped off authorities, claiming Alex fit the description of the suspect seen fleeing the scene. The prosecution painted a damning picture, connecting him to stolen goods recovered from a storage unit registered under his name. Alex's court-appointed defense attorney struggled against the mountain of evidence. Grainy surveillance footage showing a man with a similar build and gait, eyewitnesses who swore they recognized Alex's voice, and perhaps most incriminating, fingerprints found on the weapon left behind at the scene. Still, Alex maintained his innocence. "I didn't do this," he told the jury. "I wasn't anywhere near that store. I've never even touched a gun." His alibi, a claim that he was working a double shift at the delivery company that day, crumbled under scrutiny when his boss admitted on the stand that he couldn't verify Alex's whereabouts for the full day. The prosecution's closing arguments were sharp and unforgiving. "This is a man who thought he could outsmart the law," the district attorney declared. "But the evidence doesn't lie. The fingerprints don't lie. The witnesses don't lie." In contrast, Alex's defense felt feeble, almost defeated. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," his lawyer pleaded, "there are holes in this case, doubts. Isn't that enough to give this young man the benefit of the doubt?" But his voice lacked conviction and the jury wasn't swayed. The deliberation was swift, less than 3 hours. The verdict, guilty on all counts. Judge Thorne, impartial as ever, prepared to deliver a sentence he felt was justified. He had seen hardened criminals in his courtroom. To him, Alex was no different. When the sentence was handed down, it was as if the room itself exhaled. But as Judge Thorne signed the sentencing papers later that evening, a faint flicker of something unsettled him, a nagging sense he couldn't quite place. He dismissed it, chalking it up to fatigue. What Judge Thorne couldn't know was that the trial had been just the beginning. The real story was waiting for him, hidden in plain sight, and it was about to change everything. It started on an unremarkable Wednesday evening. Judge Thorne sat in his study, the warm glow of a desk lamp illuminating cluttered stacks of legal briefs and case files. Retirement had been on his mind lately, but tonight there was work to be done. A new case involving police misconduct had landed on his desk, and the allegations were serious enough to warrant extra attention. As he thumbed through the documents, something caught his eye, an evidence log from a prior investigation. At first it was just a passing glance, but then a name leapt out at him: Alex Vance. Thorne sat back, frowning. It wasn't unusual for names to resurface, but this felt different. He flipped the page, his pulse quickening. The log detailed the inventory of a police evidence locker, listing items confiscated during a separate robbery investigation that had taken place around the same time as the Sterling Jewels case. One item stood out: a gun. The description matched the weapon used in the robbery for which Alex had been convicted. The problem? This gun hadn't been submitted as evidence during Alex's trial. In fact, it hadn't been mentioned at all. Thorne leaned forward, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He cross-referenced the serial number with the trial documents still fresh in his memory. It was an exact match. Same make, same scratches on the barrel. But the report claimed this gun had been seized during an unrelated arrest 2 days after the robbery. How is that possible? He muttered under his breath. His heart raced as he pieced together the implications. If this gun had been in police custody, it couldn't have been used in the Sterling Jewels robbery. And if it wasn't the weapon, then whose fingerprints were on it? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Thorne had spent decades navigating the labyrinth of the legal system, and he knew how easily critical details could be buried. But this wasn't a mistake, it felt intentional. Determined to get answers, he requested the full case file for the unrelated robbery. It arrived the next morning, a thick folder brimming with police reports, photographs, and witness statements. The deeper Thorne dug, the more the threads began to unravel. The arresting officer in the unrelated case was the same detective who had testified during Alex's trial, Detective Miles Corbin. And then there was the anonymous tip. Thorne had barely given it a second thought during the trial, but now it seemed glaringly suspicious. He requested a subpoena for the tip line records. His unease grew with every passing hour. When the documents finally arrived, Thorne's blood ran cold. The call hadn't come from a random citizen. It had originated from a burner phone registered under the same detective's name. The walls of his office seemed to close in as the realization hit him. Alex Vance had been set up. The evidence had been manipulated. The testimony orchestrated. Thorne's stomach churned as he thought about the 60-year sentence he had handed down, the shattered life of a young man who might have been innocent all along. Thorne had always prided himself on upholding the law, but now the law felt like quicksand beneath his feet. He knew what had to be done, but the path forward was fraught with peril. As the weight of his discovery settled, Thorne made a choice. He would dig deeper no matter the cost. The truth demanded it, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Judge Thorne hadn't slept much since uncovering the discrepancies in Alex Vance's case. His mornings began with stacks of legal documents, and his nights ended with a notebook full of hastily scribbled notes. The more he investigated, the darker the picture became. The first crack in the wall came when Thorne met with an old colleague, retired investigator Daniel Hayes, over coffee in a dimly lit diner. Thorne laid out his findings. Hayes, a man with a no-nonsense demeanor and a knack for sniffing out corruption, listened intently. "This isn't just negligence, Elias," Hayes said, pushing his coffee mug aside. "If what you're saying is true, someone went to great lengths to make sure that kid took the fall." Thorne nodded grimly. "I need proof, Dan. Solid proof." Hayes agreed to help, and within days the two were neck-deep in police records, witness testimonies, and internal memos. What they found was staggering: falsified reports, missing evidence logs, and witness statements that had been altered to align with the prosecution's narrative. One witness in particular caught Thorne's attention: a store clerk who had initially identified another man as the suspect before later changing his statement to implicate Alex. Hayes tracked the man down to a small apartment on the edge of town. When they confronted him, his story came tumbling out. "I didn't want to do it," the man confessed, his hands trembling. "But Detective Corbin, he pressured me. Said if I didn't, I'd be arrested for obstruction. I didn't have a choice." Detective Corbin. The name sent a wave of anger through Thorne. This was the same officer who had submitted the false tip and concealed the evidence. As Thorne and Hayes dug deeper, they uncovered a pattern. Corbin had a history of questionable tactics: intimidating witnesses, fabricating evidence, and coercing confessions. Yet his record remained spotless, protected by layers of bureaucratic red tape. The breakthrough came when Hayes managed to recover deleted emails from Corbin's police account. One email in particular stood out. It was addressed to the district attorney and detailed a plan to ensure a conviction in the Sterling Jewels case. Attached was a list of fabricated evidence and doctored witness statements. Thorne felt a surge of rage as he read the email. The very system he had devoted his life to was rotten to its core. And yet there was no time for despair. He had the proof he needed to act. But exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. Corbin had powerful allies within the department, and Thorne knew that going public could cost him everything. His career, his reputation, even his safety. Yet, as he thought of Alex Vance sitting in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit, the decision was clear. "We go public," Thorne told Hayes one night. "No matter what it takes." The next day, Thorne filed a motion to reopen Alex's case, attaching the damning evidence against Corbin. The motion sent shock waves through the courthouse. But Thorne wasn't done. He also filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, calling for an independent investigation into Corbin and the Midview Police Department. The backlash was swift. Thorne received anonymous threats, warning him to back off. His colleagues distanced themselves and the media began to question his motives. But Thorne stood firm. The truth was out now and there was no turning back. The fallout from Judge Thorne's motion was immediate and explosive. Local headlines screamed accusations of corruption within the Midview Police Department, and public outrage spread like wildfire. For the first time in decades, Thorne felt the heat of scrutiny aimed directly at him. Some called him a hero for seeking justice. Others labeled him a traitor to the system he'd sworn to uphold. But it wasn't just public opinion that turned against him. Thorne began receiving phone calls at odd hours, with heavy silence on the other end before the line went dead. One morning he stepped outside to find his car tires slashed, a crude note scrawled on the windshield, "Drop it or else." Thorne knew the risks, but he hadn't expected the threats to escalate so quickly. Still, he refused to be intimidated. He'd seen too many lives ruined by the kind of systemic failures he was now confronting. Alex Vance's face haunted his thoughts, young, determined, and heartbreakingly resigned to a fate he hadn't deserved. Meanwhile, Detective Corbin wasn't going down without a fight. Through his attorney, Corbin denied the allegations, claiming Thorne's motion was a baseless attack aimed at tarnishing his career. "This is nothing more than a vendetta," Corbin declared in a televised interview, his polished demeanor a stark contrast to the growing evidence against him. Thorne watched from his living room, his jaw tightening with frustration. The lies were bold and calculated, but he had something Corbin didn't: the truth. As the investigation progressed, Hayes unearthed a critical piece of evidence. Security camera footage from a parking lot near the jewelry store, recorded on the day of the robbery. The footage, which had somehow never been submitted during the trial, showed a man matching Corbin's physical description leaving the scene with a duffel bag. Thorne's heart pounded as he reviewed the tape. It wasn't just exculpatory, it was damning. With this, the pieces fell into place. The robbery hadn't been a random act of violence. It had been orchestrated by Corbin himself. The next step was clear but dangerous. Thorne called for an emergency hearing to present the new evidence. The courtroom was tense as the footage played on a screen before the packed gallery. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the realization sank in. "This man," Thorne said, gesturing to the screen, "is the same detective who led the investigation against Alex Vance. He manipulated the evidence, coerced witnesses, and framed an innocent man to cover his own tracks." The reaction was immediate. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their flashes illuminating the courtroom like strobe lights. Corbin, sitting in the gallery with his lawyer, looked pale but defiant. "You're making a mistake, Thorne," he hissed as he was escorted out in handcuffs. "You don't know what you've started." The confrontation left Thorne shaken but resolute. The case was now in the hands of a higher court, and Alex Vance's conviction was being re-examined. But Thorne knew this wasn't the end, it was merely the beginning of a much larger battle. As the courtroom emptied, Thorne realized the weight of what he'd uncovered. The truth was out, but the fight for justice was far from over. Weeks later, Judge Thorne sat in the same courtroom where Alex Vance had been sentenced. But this time the air felt different. The gallery was packed with reporters, activists, and Alex's family, all waiting for the judge presiding over the retrial to make a decision. Alex, now thinner and visibly aged from his time in prison, sat quietly at the defense table. Despite the ordeal, his posture was steady, his gaze unwavering. Thorne felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the young man who had been the center of this storm, who had endured so much for a crime he hadn't committed. The evidence Thorne and Hayes had unearthed was irrefutable. The surveillance footage, falsified reports, coerced testimonies, it all pointed to a web of corruption that had framed Alex and shielded the real criminals. As the presiding judge announced the decision to overturn Alex's conviction, The room erupted in applause and tears. Alex stood, his hands trembling as his mother rushed to embrace him. For a moment time seemed to stop. Thorne, seated quietly in the back of the courtroom, allowed himself a rare smile. Justice had finally been served. But the journey had come at a cost. In the days that followed, the fallout spread far and wide. Detective Corbin faced criminal charges for his actions, and an independent investigation into the Midview Police Department revealed a culture of corruption that had gone unchecked for years. The case sparked nationwide calls for reform, with Thorne's role becoming a rallying cry for accountability within the justice system. Despite the accolades, Thorne remained introspective. He knew this victory was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The system he had once trusted was flawed, but it wasn't beyond repair, and he was determined to spend the rest of his career fighting to make it better. As for Alex, his journey was only beginning. Freed from the burden of a wrongful conviction, he vowed to dedicate his life to helping others who had been unjustly imprisoned. His story became a beacon of hope for those who believed in the power of resilience and the pursuit of truth. The story of Alex Vance and Judge Elias Thorne is a powerful reminder that justice is not infallible. It requires vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Because sometimes the fight for justice doesn't end in the courtroom, it begins there.